a few years from now, it'll be very expensive clothing, but now it's squishy toys.
Enjoy the time while it lasts. Well, I'm glad you made it. I'm going to kick us off. Welcome everyone to WeHo Reads, Inspirations and Intersections during Black History Month. This was a wet and wild week on the West Coast. If you're joining us from West Hollywood or anywhere in Southern California, I hope you're staying safe and warm. Rachel, warm and dry. And if you're joining us from the future by watching the recording, then welcome and hello from a moment of literary history in the making. I'm your host, Cody Cisco, and tonight we have four talented authors who are going to share their creative inspirations and discuss their books and their creative processes. We'll start with some focused discussion, followed by presentations by each author, and then a more freewheeling discussion, hopefully by the end. And I have a lot of questions prepared, but I also want to give our authors space to bring up what's on their minds, as well as see what you all in the audience are curious about. To that end, if you're joining us via the Zoom webinar, please use the Q&A function to enter your questions, or if you're watching via Zoom, you can use the comment function there. And now, now we get to the good part with our guests. Allow me to introduce them briefly, one by one. Rachel Howzell Hall is a Los Angeles native and the best-selling author of multiple crime novels. I met Rachel at the California Crime Writers Conference last summer, and I knew immediately that I wanted to hear more about her books and her inspirations. Lisa Teasley is the author of Fluid Stories, among other books. Here's that one. And she is the librettist of The Passion of Nell, commissioned by the Long Beach Opera. Fluid is a remarkable and surprising book of short stories that you'll want to read again and again. That's me editorializing. That's not in her bio. Jervey Tervalon is the author of All the Trouble You Need, Understand This, which was the winner of the 1994 New Voices Award from the Quality Paperback Book Club, and the acclaimed Los Angeles Times bestseller, Dead Above Ground. He also has a very creepy, compelling book called Monster Chef that takes place along the Central Coast amid the plentiful wineries there, and if you read it, you will never forget it. Tamika Thompson is the author of the speculative fiction collection Unshod, Cackling, and Naked, and a horror novella titled Salamander Justice. The stories in Unshod, Cackling, and Naked take ordinary facets of life and twist them into something horrible. You'll find dogs, trees, relationships, all terrifying. I'll be outing links to all these authors' websites and places where you can pick up their books throughout the event tonight. Now let's hear from them directly. Rachel, starting with you, tonight's theme is about finding inspiration, and we're now kind of 1 week into Black History Month. Tell us to start, what historical figure have you drawn inspiration from?
First, thank you for inviting me. We're all glad, I'm sure, to be here, especially a week like this where we're being inspired to, to use what's happening to some of us for future books. So thank you. At historical figures, there's so many, but I think about who I am and my struggles sometimes as young, well, not young anymore, but a younger Black woman living in America in Los Angeles and trying to do so many different things at one time. It's like, who really kind of embodies that for me and who has? It's Josephine Baker. In addition to her being an entertainer, she was everything. She's a spy, an entertainer, yes, a mother. She did everything. And as someone who's trying to do everything, I have looked to her to be inspired, to be entertained. She's hilarious. People fell in love with her. She was ahead of her time, and I want to be. I want to be her in some ways. I want when I'm gone or old, people say, "Oh, she's an innovator. She did something. This thing over here is important or inspired me." So yeah, Josephine Baker.
I love that. Love that. Thank you. Lisa, who inspired you? You're muted, by the way, so let's get you unmuted first.
So
there you
sorry.
go.
Hello, there I am. So, in honor of my father, who transitioned just in April of 2022, I was he computed trajectories to the moon in the space program until he was well aware of the glass ceiling. And I was thinking I was going to talk about Katherine Johnson, who was also a so-called human computer. But then I realized that I was so emotional when Harry Belafonte died last year. I was caught by surprise at how just taken with the loss. And I was listening to radio interviews and podcasts, and I had known a lot about what he had done for civil rights, the civil rights movement, but there was so much more to learn. And I had the privilege of meeting him in late 90s New York. It was a small dinner party there were no more than 12 of us, maybe 10 or 12 of us. And I sat near him and he asked me about my writing. And, when I told him the little bit that I told him about, he really encouraged me in it. He talked about the impact of the arts. I mean, him being such a huge example of that. And so that conversation about how, what we do actually has an effect in the world is infinitely inspiring to me. So I honor his memory, Harry Belafonte, and so that's my influence.
Yeah, so important. Let's see. Jervey, how about you next?
Well, I ended up writing a book based on this, my fascination with Michael Jackson. It wasn't a positive interest. It was essentially, I realized that almost everything I kind of disliked about celebrity, and just a kind of madness that only the rich and the well-known could afford. And I would just pick up information about him from different places and different people. And I guess he, had a place above Santa Barbara and that kind of stuff. And once a friend of mine, he worked at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and he said something to me that made me like so weirded out that I ended up writing a book about it. And that was that parents would line up with their kids, and Michael Jackson had a very fancy hotel room at the top floor, and the kids would go off into his room, into his hotel room, unescorted by the parents. And for some reason, since I have a couple of daughters, I became kind of enraged that the parents would allow a guy who was kind of a accused child molester that kind of time with their kids. So I ended up becoming so obsessed with that, I ended up writing a book about it. Michael, serving Michael, I guess. And so it would, that's the kind of thing that motivated me in my writing. A lot of times it's just I become enraged by something, or I become enthralled by something. My wife's Chinese, and I think eventually I'll write a book set in China, just because, I know about the subject now, and also, like the kind of racism and the that goes on there, that kind of thing. So that's kind of what I'm obsessed with these days.
Yeah, negative inspiration, writing against something is also
Yeah.
like a really, really powerful force. And I think because in different ways, each of you are writing about like the horrific or dark topics in a way, we may want to come back and talk about that some more in a bit. And Tamika, I'd love to hear your inspiration from history.
Cheers to everyone. I'm recovering from a cold, have a bit of laryngitis, but I'll try to get through everything. Before I began a career in creative writing, I was a journalist. I got my bachelor's in political science at Columbia University, and I got my master's in journalism at the University of Southern California. I went on to work in network television news and later at a PBS show that looked at news and public affairs through an African American lens. And one historical figure that I think inspired me through that entire arc of coming into that career was Ida B. Wells. She was born enslaved in the American South, and went on to become a journalist, a civil rights activist, a Black feminist who exposed the truth of lynchings of Black people in the American South at great peril to herself. And I say great peril because she was in the South at the time that she was reporting on what was going on there. And at one point, her press, her publishing house was burned down. Luckily, she was out of town, and she was able to regroup in Chicago to continue her work. But I've always been drawn to her spirit of justice, of being willing to complain, to challenge, to make a lot of noise about things that were wrong during her time. I think it's easy for us nowadays, for sure, to overlook injustice because it is a lot of work and a lot of risk to confront racism, to confront racist people, to confront unjust systems, particularly because racism is systemic. But Ida B. Wells, she never backed down. She sued a train company for not honoring her first class ticket. She challenged white feminists who were silent about lynchings and the mistreatment of Black people in the South, which I think is really informative for me today, and I think for all of us today, because we have to continue to challenge white feminists as a Black feminist and as a woman of color, a person of color, for their continued silence on issues that are important to Black people, to poor people, incarcerated and imprisoned people, people who are sitting on death row, kids who are locked in cages at the border. And there's one quote I wanted to share with you from her. She said, "The facts have been so distorted that the people in the North and elsewhere do not realize the extent of the lynchings in the South." And she said that in June of 1895. And I think in 2024, that idea of the distortion of facts is so important for us to consider. We have a presidential election coming up this year, and I think for the past decade, on the national political stage, facts have become so distorted that the lies have become the truth. And so, if you're not familiar with Ida B. Wells, I say get familiar with her. Go out and read her work, understand what she was telling us. I think so much of what she said and did informs us today so that we can continue to move this country forward and make sure it works for everybody and not just a few people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I hope that this inspired some of the audience to think about, figures that they can read more about and learn about. And I wrote down what you said. It is a lot of work and risk to confront racism. And I think you're right. And, we do this bit by bit, and sometimes in bigger ways and smaller ways. So I want to transition a little bit now to thinking about more in the literary book publishing world, where each of you have drawn your inspiration or authors, like Rachel said earlier, someone you aspire to be. I think we all have those authors that we grew up reading, or that so touched us that we think of them when we're like, what kind of writer do I want to be? I'd love to hear from each of you about that. And I think maybe we go just to the same order, starting with Rachel.
I have two, actually. The first, he's on the screen in the pink room right now. Jervey and I met a long time ago when I was working at Penn Center USA West, and I was the administrative assistant. And, I was young and I wanted to write. I didn't really think I could write. It wasn't like a thing back in 92 or 93, 94. But I worked for this incredible organization. I met Jervey when I was running the Pen in the Classroom program, and I sent him and Gary Phillips and a few other writers, David Ulan, into classrooms around Los Angeles to teach kids about writing. And, just seeing this live, a Black person, especially in Los Angeles, writing these contemporary stories about my neighborhood, my friends, things that my brothers have gone through. It was inspiring. And I wanted right then to really, really, really be a writer, not just the I want to be a writer, the lofty thing, but like the real thing. I can actually do this. And he talked to me, he encouraged me, he gave me actually his agent's email. Was there email back then? It probably was Netscape, but yeah, he gave me the email. And it meant a lot to me that someone that I admired, someone who had succeeded, took their time to, in some ways, mentor me. So thank you, Jervey. I've said this a lot of times, but I can never say thank you enough.
That's very
And
true.
then and then my other answer is, one of the North Stars, Toni Morrison, of course, the language, but also she was a writing mom. And I remember reading an interview where she talks about being a writing mom and how she'd have her baby in one arm and she'd be writing in the other arm, and her baby would throw up on the legal pad and she'd just write around it. And to me, that's like, as someone who still has a day job and who is a mom, that just kind of encouraged me that someone as bright and wonderfully talented and committed to her family as Toni Morrison, and she's writing around vomit. I can do that. It's okay to do that. It makes you, a more interesting storyteller when you're writing around literal obstacles to what you're trying to get down. So those are my two.
Yeah, that you just saw an intersection here between two of our writers. I love that. Lisa.
I love everything Rachel just said about Jervey and everything that Rachel said about Toni Morrison. Just perfection. And so I'm going to bring another writer into the mix. When I was very, very young writer, I wrote Alice Walker, ostensibly about how did you lock your hair? But of course, my letter talked about, being a young writer and in an interracial relationship, blah, blah, blah. And she wrote me back. A package came in the mail that I just remember jumping up and down and squealing. It was a copy of her book, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. The book it was coming out like the following week, and she signed it in sisterhood. She signed it to me in sisterhood. Then inside was a card that on the cover was a picture of her when she was 10 years old and her hair kind of everywhere. And inside she detailed instructions of how to lock my hair, either the natural way, like by cutting it off and or starting with the permed hair. And from there, we started a bit of a correspondence. And I had read everything, up until that point. And I read her last book when it came out, The Diaries. All writers should read her latest book. That is, any working writer would appreciate, any aspiring writer would appreciate these diaries that go over the day-to-day inspiration or the non-inspiration or the discipline, the finance, what getting paid, not getting paid, relationships, children, everything is in there. So I can't, send enough love to Alice.
Yeah, I love these stories of mentorship and of, like established writers really trying to give a boost and a push to more, writers earlier in their careers. I think that's really, really important and great to see. And Tamika, you're up next. There you go.
Say thank you to Jervey as well. Jervey was there in the beginning with me and a group of writers that I was with when I was in LA, and he really encouraged me early on. So I think we're all going to be paying our respects to Jervey. I will say that when I began my creative writing career, I was blessed to discover Tananarive Due. She is a Black speculative fiction author. She has written novels, short stories, documentaries, films. She's done some television episodes for The Twilight Zone, and she teaches at UCLA. And my writing was already dark at the time that I came to read her work. But I think her work showed me what horror writing could really accomplish. I was an avid reader of Octavia Butler, the late famed science fiction writer. But I think it wasn't until I read Tananarive Due that I looked at the literary possibilities within the horror genre. I think it is telling that her background, Tananarive Due's background, was also in journalism because the depths of her research really comes through in her books. A couple of my favorites are The Between, which was her debut. And if you've read any of her work, you've probably read The Good House. Any of her works, the African Immortal series is all amazing. And on a personal note, I was lucky enough to take a horror writing workshop with her. And I'm so glad that she shared her PowerPoint presentation with us after it was over, because I spent the entire time that I was in there just in this like fangirl trance. Every time she spoke, I was just so in awe of her, and she was so giving to all of us. She gave us a wonderful piece of advice. And if there are any aspiring writers watching, I will share. And it was to hone our craft with short stories. And I think it's no coincidence that my debut fiction, my book length fiction, is a short story collection, because I just, I took that advice and I kind of ran with it. I think it was so giving of her to share that with us, and it really helped me on my way. And when my book came out last year, she sent me an autographed copy of one of her books, and I was like, way to go. And it was like such a full circle moment. So Tananarive too, if you haven't read her, start reading her.
That is beautiful. And I think, one of the things that I love about like being able to do this series is that like there's so many writers that need a platform and a voice. And so I'm taking notes. Maybe we'll have to get Tananarive back here once again. At this point, I just want to pause for a moment and say thank you to the City of West Hollywood for making the funds available to present this series. Also to the UCLA Writers Extension, the UCLA Extension Writers Program, for some additional financial support that makes this possible, and to our media partners, Los Angeles Review of Books and Book Soup, which is in West Hollywood, and a great place to buy all of these authors' books. I'm going to introduce now the...
Jervey didn't get a chance.
Jervey didn't go. I messed up. Jervey, you're on.
Okay.
You're up.
I just wanted to mention, my brain froze, but the great science fiction writer of Altadena, well, actually, she's a great science fiction writer, but she happened to live in Altadena. And I just wanted to say this, I can't think of her name suddenly.
Octavia Butler.
Yeah, I was at some party and we got to talking, and she said her big problem was that her mother would do these really nice things for her on her birthday. So she gave her a $100 bill, and she was stuck. She was embarrassed, and her mother insisted that she go out and buy something at Ralph's with a $100 bill. So when she went to Ralph's, they took the $100 bill from her and called the police. So she was actually arrested because of the woman's because of their thinking that she was up to something. And she said the most embarrassing thing was her childhood enemy saw her getting pushed into the police car. And as soon as they got her to the police station and they checked out the $100 bill, they realized it was actually real, and she was released. And she laughed about it as though it wasn't at all something that inconvenienced her. It's just one of those weird things in life. So you don't think that would actually happen to somebody like that.
Yeah, and I think so many things in life seem implausible, right? If we wrote about them in fiction, no one would believe it, but they happen every day, all the time. And yeah, that's part of our job, is make it seem believable. Okay, we're back on track. I'm going to ask Mike to join now. Mike, you're up.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, first of all, to all four of our authors for being a part of WeHo Reads. A couple of you are returning after several years, and it's just great to have you here. And of course, thank you to Cody for organizing and producing our series on behalf of the City of West Hollywood. I'm Mike Che. I'm the arts coordinator for the city, and we want to take a moment to acknowledge that the land upon which the city of West Hollywood sits is located on the occupied, unceded seized territory of the Gabrielino Tongva and Gabrielino Kizh peoples, who have stewarded this land throughout generations. I know that in the past, we've had people tune in from all across the country and the world. So we encourage you to find out who the traditional caretakers are of the lands where you are, and you can find them at native-land.ca. This is an online event, and we have a lot of our past programs available to still view on the WeHo Arts YouTube channel. But there are two upcoming in-person events that if you're in the LA area, you'll want to save the dates for. April 17, during National Poetry Month, we have the Poetry Spa Day, which is, I mean, who doesn't want a poetry spa day? It's going to be lots of fun and curated by our current city poet laureate and started by our former poet laureate. And then in May, on May 8th, we have Asian Diaspora Talk Story. So those are both happening in West Hollywood. You can find out that information at weho.org/wehoreads. This series could not happen without the continued support of our city council and our arts commission. We are so lucky to have our mayor here and one of our council members, Councilmember Lauren Meister, who would like to say a few words of welcome for you, to all of you. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our mayor, John Erickson.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
I am doing like we all do, dodging from rain place to rain place in my car, going from event to event. But I see my colleague, Councilmember Meister, is safe and tucked away at home. But I love coming on to our WeHo Reads events and just truly not only uplifting and honoring all of you as a part of the panel tonight, but also making sure that you know how much we love this event and all of you from the city of West Hollywood. We have and are going to continue to prioritize the arts and all that we do. You might not have heard, but we had a $31 million surplus in our budget this year. And so what does that mean? That means for me as an elected that we need to continue to invest in the things that matter to our community. That's always community safety, that's housing, but that's things that bring people a lot of joy in some crazy times, if I might add. And that's, of course, the arts and all of you and everything that we do. And so I want to thank you for being that shining star in a little bit of the darkness that we have out there. And thank you for all the beauty each and every one of you bring into the world. And I'm going to turn it over to my amazing colleague, Councilmember Meister.
Well, thank you very much, Mayor, and good evening, everyone. And I just want to say welcome to our audience and thank you to the talented artists that are here tonight to help us kick off Black History Month. We really appreciate your being here. And I've been listening to your stories and your answers to Cody, and it's really wonderful and heartwarming. And I just want to thank also our staff who brought forward this incredible program. So Mike, thank you so much, and all of you from our arts department, and let's just keep this going. Thanks, everyone. Look forward to hearing the rest of the program.
And thank you both for continuing to support the arts and really showing how much you care about the arts and community. So we'll turn it back over to the people who we want to hear from, the authors and Cody.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mayor Erickson. Thank you, Councilmember Meister. Well, I'm feeling good. So I would love now for Rachel. So when I was thinking about what we want to do tonight, I really wanted to go kind of deeper into your creative work, your recent books, and the inspirations, and where all these ideas come from. and the path that you took to get them. So I'm going to turn it over to you. And for everyone who's here in the chat, I'll be sending links to Rachel's stuff, so where you can read more of her books, and all of that good information.
Well, thank you for that. I've had quite a journey. My very first book was published on the first anniversary of 9/11, so I came in hot that way. And this was in 2002, of course. It was well received, it was well published, but there are reasons why I probably still won't get a royalty check, even, it's 20 years later. Part of it was what's happening in the film American Fiction. I was told a few times by some editors that, my voice wasn't Black enough, it wasn't urban enough. West Coast, we have palm trees and streets and cars, and everybody's beautiful in LA. And so it just wasn't gritty enough for the powers that be back then that were gatekeeping. But I wanted to write what I wanted to write, and I felt that my experience was just not my experience, but a whole bunch of Black people who experienced different facets of Black life. So I kept writing, and I kept writing, and while I'm writing, I was figuring out who I was and what I wanted to write. Toni Morrison is my North Star, and I thought that I had to write like her. I had to, take issues like that and make them very important, capital V, capital I. And while I wanted to talk about very important things, I didn't want to tell it like that, which is why, Jervey and Gary Phillips and B.B. Moore Campbell were very helpful to me. And as I'm writing more and more, I'm figuring out that I like crime. I grew up in they call it the jungle in Baldwin Hills, the Dons down there, but not the nice parts. And so as a kid, I was always kind of fascinated with crime. We were the family that were very aspirational. We just couldn't afford to live in the nice places, but my parents expected a lot from us. And so I always knew that what I saw was kind of a different take than what some other people saw, some other Black folks saw. We grew up with the helicopters and the gunshots and all that craziness. And that combined with me being raised Seventh-day Adventist, it was a weird childhood because I couldn't understand why people did the things they did, where here I am not doing this and this and this because of religion and, scared of going to hell. And so that made me write and try and figure things out and confront things that I didn't understand and were scared of. And as I'm still continuing to not be published, I was going through some health issues. The 30s are just a crazy age to grow up. And I figured out that I was interested in writing crime mystery thrillers. And my stories, the first ones were police procedurals of an LAPD cop who patrolled her own neighborhood where she grew up. But then as I kept writing and kept figuring out what it was and what my voice was and all that, I've come to see that I write about Black women in spaces where they don't belong. My current book, What Never Happened, it's the story of a young Black woman who, back 20 years before the story starts, she and her family bought a house on Catalina Island. And as we know, Catalina Island is shiny and perfect, but we know it's not shiny and perfect. We know that not many Black people live there, I would say less than 2, maybe 1.75. And there's a reason for that. Racist reasons, of course. But I wanted to take this woman and put her on an island where it's already isolated, even though it's 26 miles away from, across the Pacific. I wanted her isolated. I wanted her isolated because she's mourning a family that used to live there, her family, and who were murdered in that house that they were supposed to live in. And I wanted to take that isolation and grief and multiply it with the story taking place at the beginning of the pandemic. So isolation upon isolation upon isolation, which, as African Americans and as African American women especially, there are times when we are, isolated, when we're not a part of that, or where we're told that we don't belong there. And looking back, all my stories are similar. The story that's coming out in June, called What Fire Brings, it's another story of a woman who is searching for a missing friend in Topanga Canyon during fire season. Again, do I belong here? What happens when I transgress and put myself in these spaces? And I'm also finding, as a mother of a 19-year-old, I'm concerned about her. And so my stories are turning from, my friends and me and just how, crazy and wonderful and all that, to be a Gen Xer in America right now. I have a 19-year-old daughter who's in college and she's away from me. And I worry about her because she's a young Black girl in a place that she didn't grow up, dealing with things away from me, and I'm scared. And so my books are reflecting that, young Black women in spaces where not only they may not, or they not necessarily not belong, but they're resented for being there. They're resented for wanting to tell their own stories, for wanting to be the main character in their stories, and what happens when someone doesn't want you to be the main characters in your own story. So looking back and saying, oh, Toni Morrison, I'm so far away from what I thought I wanted to write. I am writing that. She wrote stories that weren't just your typical, trauma stories about Black life. And she did it with language that may not have been like the easiest to understand when you're first reading it. And for some readers, my stories aren't the easiest either when, even though it's mystery, I'm talking about real life issues. And so, she remains my North Star because of the way she told stories and because of the way she introduced very difficult ideas in a way that, one, entertained, but also provoked thought, made you stop and think about what she's saying. So those are the types of stories I write. I'm writing my first, I'm publishing my first romantasy. I'm in the romantasy thing right now. And it's coming out in July, called The Last One. And even though it's fantasy and romance, it's still another story about a woman who's in a place where people think she doesn't belong. And romance. So it's a little difficult for me. Well, it was, because I write crime scenes, not sex scenes. So I had to do a lot of learning. But it's fun. It gives me yet one more place to talk about those things that worry me, that I'm trying to figure out, and that I'm sure other people are trying to figure out too.
Yeah, it's fascinating, the core of your inspiration, what stays the same, and then those things that evolve too as your life evolves. I love that. And everyone should pick up this book right away and look forward to the romantasy that comes. I plan on saying that word so much over the next few months just because it's fun.
It's a thing. It's a
thing. Lisa, let's hear from you next.
So I basically knew I wanted to be a writer from the age of 5, and was lucky enough to have teachers all along the way who encouraged me. And so I started publishing in literary magazines from like the age of 19 on, but it took 20 years to get a book deal because the agent I had an agent at William Morris who shopped the book everywhere and got the same response, which was, what do we do with a Black female writer who writes about all kinds of characters? There aren't any stereotypical Black characters. They actually, a lot of the letters, were a lot, ruder than that and a lot blunter than that about like, what do we do? And it wasn't until Zadie Smith's White Teeth came out in 2001 that I made any sense. And so that's why then I got a book deal the following year, or actually it was kind of the same year. My first book came out in 2002, a story collection, Glow in the Dark. And then I had 2 novels, Dive and Heat Signature. And now the latest is another story collection, Fluid. And Fluid is comprised of 16 stories, and the common thread is choice. So it's very diverse characters, you know, culture, background, sex, sexuality, race. But what they have in common is that they're at a significant moment of choice, and with issues such as, you know, surrogacy, euthanasia, genocide, transhumanism. And I thought I would read just a couple paragraphs from the numerologist, the first page, which is about climate change. So the numerologist. A week before summer solstice, the numerologist Tim Luna worries the date into perfect configuration for Armageddon. He sleeps in a large closet surrounded by stacks of newspaper and magazine clippings salvaged from his parents' garage in the medical district, low-end flats of Beverly Hills. The closet scent has acid for a top note, gasoline and mildew in the heart, and cat scat at the base. His partner, a very skilled body worker who calls herself Kiva Hands, breaks down into tears when she first confronts the closet and tells Tim, when he asks, that she will never move in with him as long as he had it. He is a hoarder. You have to make a perilous path from the living room into the kitchen. Anywhere away from this place, to Kiva, he is irresistible. Still, she doesn't believe any of his doomsday warnings. Bank account deletions, AI takeover, water wars, food depletion, mandatory oxygen masks, or brain chips, your choice. She holds love over fear and conspiracy, as he so passionately does the opposite. She counts good news like lab-grown meat and seafood and the coral reef flourishing in the Red Sea. He bats his long-lashed, deep brown eyes at her, shakes his head, and though his slow smile intimates that she is naive, it also says he wants her to be right. Summer solstice comes and goes, autumnal equinox comes and goes, as does Halloween. Then exactly 1 week before winter solstice, LA is hotter than any summer on record. And though this is not significant in itself, the world for Kiva shifts into hyperrealism. Colors glare obscenely. Plants stand stark and carnal against the street. Palm trees hover, whispering to one another. And the sky is close and clear, like high-definition TV, while the meteorologists keep saying there is smog. Rainbows occurs on days as dry as the desert. The sunsets are pinker, glowing malevolent and neon. Birds squawk directly at her. Butterflies chase her. Squirrels approach and stare. Clouds cumulus and errant, streak in parallel to the chemtrails Tim rages about. And the moon is always in view during the day. When is it waxing? When is it waning? She has a strange pressure in her chest, can no longer keep track of time, and her heart is continually opening.
Thank you. That sense of reality just like subtly shifting and shifting more until it becomes almost, you know, unrecognizable is I remember that from that story. I'm putting links to Lisa's stuff in the chat. You can find her at lisateasley.com and also at Lisa Teas on Instagram.
That was lovely.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is the one you want. Jervey, could we hear from you next?
Yeah, one of the things I discovered as I got more serious about writing is that it wasn't so directing all my energies towards being creative wasn't the best thing. What I found out I needed to be was observant and to just pay attention to this world around me. And as I did, you know, the writing became a lot easier. And where I grew up in the on Second Avenue, close to Jefferson in LA. And I went to Dorsey High School, and there was always a lot to think about and to write about. And, eventually I went off to college. And when I came home, I wanted to teach. So I got a job at Locke High School. That's considered, kind of tough high school, but there were really great students there. And two of my students, sometimes, the kids wouldn't come on a regular basis. And these two girls would come, probably about half the time. And one of them said to me after, I don't know, a few months, she said, Mr. Tervalon, just want to let you know that I'm going to be leaving. And me and her girlfriend, they weren't coming back. So as that high school teacher, I didn't know exactly what to do. I could report them. Maybe they would, I don't know, end up having to deal with their parents or something. So I just kind of did nothing. And so I said, well, why are you leaving? And they said, because my mother keeps putting my little brother in the oven. And then I was just like, what? What am I supposed to do? Report this. So the class ended, and one of them said, I just wanted to say goodbye. And I never saw them again. And I just wondered, for a long time, what could have happened to them. And so I ended up writing a book called Hope Found Chauncey to answer those questions for me, what it would be like to leave with your little brother and disappear into, I don't know, Salt Lake City, because for some reason I decided the novel should be end up in Salt Lake City and amongst the Mormons or something. But it was a very satisfying book to write, and it made me feel back to where I started from, and that is, South Central LA, and how one has to come up to be able to survive it and to maybe even make their way in the world. So the book essentially was kind of honoring all those folk that had to deal with those kinds of things.
Yeah. I mean, rough life, and then turning that into fiction as well.
But also kind of like just saying that, by the way, as though it's normal, but that's the absurdity of life, right? That's when it's just, what?
Yeah. And I still haven't found a publisher for it. For some reason, my agent was like, Jesus Christ. There's the whole mess of the idea of the agent. I mean, and you realize so much of it is just really creepy. It's like, stay sane if you don't have any expectations of anyone advancing whatever you're trying to accomplish. And, occasionally somebody does come across, or you find an agent that is true to their word and that kind of thing. But often it's just, depressing.
I made all my deals myself. I didn't work with an agent for any of the forms.
It's so awesome. That's why I admire you so much, Lisa.
No, but it's just because it just didn't work out each time that there was like a flirtation or something, and then it was just like, ghosted or something. So
the ghosting was a big
or attempted to be cheated. It just all kinds of.
Oh, wow.
I think it's just my own weird. How we all have different, things that we tend to attract, or
Right.
that tends to repeatedly happen. With me, it's the agent not working out.
Yeah, well, I think it's true for a lot of us. Fucking agents, man.
I'm blessed. Finally.
Let's hear from Tamika, and then I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation.
Transition from journalism to being a creative writer. I spent 2 years studying youth violence in America and became fascinated with the idea of the abused becoming the abuser, because in the research what I was finding is that it really didn't matter where the suspect originated, whether it was a suburban school shooter, a so-called inner city homicide, which often is labeled gang-related which often is not necessarily gang related, or if it's a mass shooting that takes place in a mall or at a concert, the one thread, the one thing that all of these young people had in common is that they had been victimized at some point. They had either experienced violence directly, or they had witnessed violence of someone who was close to them, someone that they loved, usually within their household. And so my collection, Unshod, Cackling, and Naked, it was a decade in the making, because many of the stories that are in the collection, the 13 Tales, have been published elsewhere first. But it really is an examination of a character's capacity for violence. One of the stories in there, called I Am Goddess, is about a woman who wants beauty treatments, and she kind of chants this mantra of I am goddess. And this story received some critical praise. It first appeared in a horror anthology. And in the course of this story, she's arguing with her abusive and controlling husband over the cost of these treatments, and he ends up accidentally calling her ugly. And this was a transition point for her, because so much of what she had experienced in life had been about her value, and that her value was really in her looks, and she never felt like she measured up. And her value was also in her ability to get and keep a man. It didn't so much matter whether or not the man was any good, just that she had one. And so this argument that they have kind of moves from inside of the house to outside, where she gets a pair of garden shears and begins taking his laundry off the clothesline with the shears. I'm going to share a little excerpt, a couple of paragraphs for you. Her husband says to her, Lyra, that's my work shirt. They'll dock my pay for that. They should dock your pay. I should dock your pay as well. Her throat burned as the shouts came out. She tossed up another shirt, snip, right in the middle. The two halves fell to the ground. He didn't move. He held out his arms to her with disbelief on his face. Lyra, but he still didn't move. She must have looked as mad as she felt. Not angry mad, out of control mad. She hated him, but she hated herself more for letting him treat her this way. She was smart, snip. Had a degree, snip. A salary, snip. Was a manager, snip. Another shirt up, snip. Another snip. The last snip. When all 5 of his work shirts were cut in half in the middle of the yard, she grabbed the heap of his pants and was about to toss those up as well, but he grabbed her arm. Enough, Lyra. She snatched her arm away and grabbed his Raiders jersey. It would break his heart if she cut it. She tossed up the jersey. He snatched it, but the timing was off, so she ended up slicing his forearm with the shears. I am goddess. Her words echoed off her home's brick and all down their street. The dog barked faster and louder. More neighbors turned on lights in the backs of their homes. A bolt of lightning appeared in the sky, brightening the blood on his skin, allowing her to see how quickly it flowed from him. He moaned, shuddered, and fell to the grass holding his arm. She felt light, otherworldly, as if she were floating above herself, watching the shears come to rest on the grass, witnessing the raindrops rinse the blood from the blade. And so this is her transition, right? This is her moment where she goes from the abused to the abuser. And I have my own ideas on this. I think that some of the most virtuous people have the capacity for violence, have the capacity to not be so virtuous when they get pushed hard enough. So that's sort of my collection. If you read on Lyra's story, this is just the beginning. This is an origin story for her. Since it's horror, I like to have a little fun with the characters. I didn't stop there at the forearm.
Thank you, Tamika. And I'm remembering one of the stories of a similar nature with an eyelash curler, and the capacity for violence with the eyelash curler, which was so constrained but also kind of epic. And so maybe now I want to maybe transition and have this be a group conversation about writing about, violence or crime or this capacity for evil in a way, and what you as a writer, like, how do you move through that? Like, what does it do to you? What how do you
Kind of paralyzes you because, I can't believe what I just heard. My mother, her father was abusive and he beat her mother. And so my mother grew up with this idea that if a man lifts his hands to you, you're obligated to kill him. And she was serious about it. And, no one kind of gave her any trouble because of her. She figured out how to channel her anger into something constructive, like trying to take out men that were abusive.
Wow. For me, like I said, it is really personal, but I chose mystery crime to tell that story, these violent stories, these tragic stories, because it's a perfect, there's a reason why there are thousands of CSIs and SVUs and all the rest of it, because there's a great structure. People know that there's someone who wants vengeance. There's someone who is you who will seek this out and try and figure it out. It's not necessarily a good ending because for crime, for victims of crime, there is no closure. And so, but there's hope. And as someone who has seen violence personally, who a few years ago we were, in our house on a Thursday morning, not knowing that there was someone in our house at that moment stealing our things, and I didn't know, something that close that could have happened and it didn't. I'm fascinated and terrified by that. And everyone's fascinated and terrified by it. And this is how I choose to reconcile it. When I was in high school, and someone said that they always started dark. I think it was you, Tamika. My English teacher would, my papers, my creative writing, she would mark me off because she's like, why are your stories so dark? They're so depressing. And, it pissed me off because this is what I'm trying to, this is how I tell a story. But, get the grade. And so I would write these over the top, saturation, overly saturated, sweet, happy stories to get the grade. But, that was my first instance of trolling. But people are, uncomfortable with the worst things in life. And that's what actually kind of happens to us all the time, or to the people that we love.
And I say this all the time, but Meryl Streep once said, when asked, how do you find these characters, these various characters, and just nail them that way? She said, we all have everyone in us. And that's the way I approach every story. So, and I can remember in my first collection, the first story, the character would be seen from the outside world as a pedophile. But when I was writing a story as third person close from his point of view, he was Marty. I didn't even know he was a pedophile until the end, until I was done, until I, this is who he is. The same goes for murderers and rapists and all these things. They're not that while I'm writing. It is whatever their name is, because if I'm judging what my character's doing as I'm writing it, it's not true. It's just my pity party, or my look at or my scorn, so I think it's really important that we, look at everyone as human, no matter where they are on the scale of good and bad, because we all have the beauty to the hideousness in us. It just depends on how we were raised, what we came up in, what we were up against, how we respond to the world.
Yeah. There's a saying, and especially in crime writing, that everyone's a villain in someone else's story. There's someone right now who cannot stand you, and they may have very good reason, And so as a writer, you have to go there and see, why would this person hate me? And that's a very good exercise when writing a fully realized, not mustache twirling kind of villain that everybody kind of writes, but someone who is, like you just said, who is full and makes sense in some ways. And I mean, that's why we all like the Darth Vaders and the Scars of the world, because we've been jealous, we've been scorned, we've been forgotten. And how we deal with that and who gets to decide that we're the villains is a very interesting, way of writing.
I'm thinking also of like protagonists who are compromised in some way, or whose judgment is impaired, or who from their background or from what they undergo, like become, not the greatest version of themselves. And maybe speak to those characters and why they're important to you to get right.
Jump in. I have a character in one of my stories called Bridget Has Disappeared. And he's essentially a good guy. He's a journalist. He falls in love with this woman and she continues to disappear and reappear. And he becomes obsessed with knowing what is happening with her. And he, up until this point, has no real capacity to be abusive or controlling. But it's interesting because people who have read this story, many of them have come to me and said that in the very beginning, they think that he's going to turn abusive and that he's going to be very controlling, because he does, to a certain extent, start to question her and start to attempt to control her. But overall, he's a good guy. But this idea of knowing her and losing her makes him so obsessed, and he does start to become dark over the course of the story. And so I found the me in him when I was telling his story, just because I think anybody who has a background in journalism, it becomes very curious and has to know, right? You have to have the answer. You can't set up this mystery and not get to the answer. And so the story almost becomes not about his love for her, it becomes about his, needing to know. And it turns him into a very, not, I wouldn't say a dark character, but definitely darker than when he started out. But I think that, there's evil in every virtuous character, and there's virtue in every evil character. And I've had a couple other stories. My Salamander Justice, my novella, there's a guy in there who's a pacifist, and he thinks he's so wonderful and he's so kind until he gets angry, right? Until he gets angry and he thinks he's about to lose this woman to his brother, of all people, and all of a sudden that violence shows up. But I identify with all of them. I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily a violent person, but I identify with that thing in them where it's like, everything is starting to fall apart, right? Everything is starting to fall apart, and they become so desperate, and they are clinging, they are hanging on to whatever it is that they either need to know or they need to have, and they need to find out. And I think that Bridget story really connected with a lot of readers, is actually being translated into Italian, which I'm really excited about. So other readers outside of this country will be able to connect and see what they think of Yusuf.
Something you said, Tamika, makes me wonder about like endings, and maybe not happy endings, but satisfying endings, and or like questions that you let linger on, and where you land in terms of bringing the story to a close, but not wrapping it up so neatly that it doesn't seem like reality anymore, I guess, or a version of reality. Lisa, do you have any?
Yes, well, I was just thinking, when you said that, I was thinking about the fact that I've never plotted out a novel or a story, and how different that is from, for example, the opera libretto that I'm writing now, or the times that I've been asked to write a screenplay, or documentary, whatever, where you have to know before you're going in what the structure is and the beats that you're hitting. But I've always been a very character-driven writer, and so I don't know the ending until I get there with the character. And it's just, so by the end, I'm just as surprised as any reader is going to be.
You know, I am a plotter. Oh my gosh, I'm like a master plotter. And if you're writing, crime mystery, you kind of in some ways have to because red herrings and all the rest of it. But even though I am a plotter, it's still sometimes it's not the person that I thought it was. And she's not this person that I thought she was. When my agent whenever she wants to read like a first draft, they're crappy because, and I always tell her, well, I don't know who these people are. I know their names, maybe, but you don't really know until you hit that first draft. And it's like, that's actually what my story is about. And she's actually that thing over there. And it feels good. It may take you some, time to get there, but it it makes for a more authentic character when yeah, you can plan, but listening to what you know and what you think should happen and applying all the things that you know and you learned from the last book, the last piece. And yeah, it's a weird process because we all end up in the same place, no matter if you're a plotter or pantser.
Yes.
Let's talk about that revision for a little bit. I'm curious if you've ever had the experience of say coming to the end of that first draft or even being in the middle of a revision process and just like you kind of blow your own mind and realize that you weren't doing what you thought you were doing, you're doing something else, and maybe it was better than you thought at the beginning. Like have you ever surprised yourself throughout the revision process?
Oh yeah, I mean it's constant
I
for me,
don't, I'm
especially
sorry that I pick up.
a whodunit. With this romantasy, since I don't know how to, this is my first. I've had to rewrite it a few times because mystery it's pacey. It's 90,000 words. Law is law, crime is crime. It happens, but with the ladies who write spec and all that. I'm creating this world that doesn't exist, and I refuse to believe it because I write crime. And so, in addition to learning how to do that, incorporating romance into something that I don't write romance, but lately for this last book, my editor is like, why is there a romance in this crime novel? Oh, I'm like crossing. I didn't mean that. It's like Reese's peanut butter. You got my peanut butter and my chocolate. But I've had to go back and back and back to rewrite the story that I'm learning and realizing that fantasy needs words. When they say world building, they mean like world building. And I was at like 110,000 words, and they're like, that's not, you need more, like 130, 40,000. And, for someone who likes getting in and out of the story, that was like Narnia to me. What do you mean? I need 60,000 more words. What is that? So yeah, revising turns different when you're, breaking into a new genre because what I thought that I knew, because 16 books in, I know some things.
Yeah.
I don't know everything. And I'm excited, but terrified because I don't know some things.
Yeah.
And
Does that newness, like, is that like sparking a lot for you?
yeah, I mean, it really is exciting. I mean, the whole world building thing where I'm creating religion and politics and all these things that I can't do really in crime, it is exciting. But that excitement is tempered some because the readership, they're like serious into, the fantasies and all the things that you have to do. And it's a different world than crime and mystery. So while I'm very excited, I'm terrified because it's my first, but it's also kind of high profile. So I can't mess up. So already, the pressure that writers all go through with anything you write and scared you don't go on Goodreads, you don't do all that stuff. It's like extra crispy for me right now.
Well, for
I found that, did I interrupt
go ahead.
you? I was just going to say briefly that I've found that in revising the novels that I've written, that that maybe my chapter 5 was actually my chapter 1. That's happened with each of them. And so there's something about that pattern as well that, that when I got going, that really the beginning was, in the first quarter.
That throat clearing that you do.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Tamika, or Jervey, have you experienced that, or what was it like for you when the story veers kind of in a way you didn't expect?
I was thinking of one of my stories, I Will Be Glorious, which I didn't actually think when I started writing it was going to be a horror story at all. It's a contemplation of grief. It's a young woman who moves into a house, and she is slowly unraveling in this house because of a tree in the backyard that is frightening her. And she lost her brother when she was younger, who fell out of a tree. And so I just thought this was going to be, just a literary story I was going to send to a literary magazine. But as I continue to write, and she's narrating it, as I continue to write, this tree takes on a life of its own in the story, in a speculative way, and her grief and her physicality of her experiencing the house and the tree all start to merge by the end of the story. I won't give it away, but it's definitely hardcore speculative by the time it gets to the end. And she's even struggling to write by the end, because she's kind of, her body is starting to stiffen. It was a fun one to write, because a couple of the stories I will actually start from the end. I'll get like an image in my mind that'll be the conclusion. And the final story in my collection, I wrote that one backwards almost, because I just had this image in my mind of where the character ended up physically. But not with this one. With this one, it was because I am a plotter, but with this one, I was kind of pantsing it, and it was so much fun. And I was really happy with where it ended up. Sometimes you just got to let it go, right? You just got to let it flow, let it come on. That's the fun part, right?
Yes.
Jervey, how about you? And you got to unmute, my friend. Let's see. I can press a button and that might help.
It's like Jervey's having a party at his house or something.
Right?
All this movement.
So you can't plot this.
No.
It just kind of happens.
While he's finding the button, about that, the story, Tamika, it's so interesting to hear you say like what you didn't intend it to be horror, because the narrator is like so unreliable, right? Like you're like, okay, what's going on here? And then shit starts to happen.
Right. She's so funny, and she's young and she's youthful. I think that's why I just kind of was like, you know what, I'm just gonna let her go and do her thing.
And like, speaking of characters that can be, virtuous or villains, right? Depending on what happens. And I do want to come back eventually to this idea of like the victim who becomes the victimizer, because it's this like sense of like these cycles that exist. But we'll come back to that in a second. Jervey's back. He's getting his steps in.
Usually for me, it's just paying attention to things around me, or paying attention to my family. Luckily I had a family. My extended family is pretty how can I say this? Essentially, they're theatrical in some bizarre way. So there's always some sort of mayhem. Somebody fell into a vat of boiling something other, or my mother becomes enraged and attacks one of her relatives that she feels is being unfair, that kind of thing. So for me, it was just like paying attention. And my mother once said something to me that stayed with me my entire life. And that she said, if a man lifts his hands to hurt you, a woman is obligated to kill him. And I was like, what? But it was her way of thinking about how you had to deal with people in an abusive world. And my grandfather was very abusive, and he beat my grandmother a lot. And my mother spent her time, she said, trying to kill him. And he was terrified of my mother. So to some extent, it was just not doing anything but trying to get that down on paper, because I didn't need to imagine anything. It was beyond my imagination. And yeah, she actually said, just in general, if a woman runs into an abusive man, she has an obligation to kill him. And I was like, wow, I'll be very kind to all the women I've ever met in my life, or I'll meet in my life. So it was fun to write about her.
Yeah. I think before we were talking about cycles, and you brought it back to that idea of, what do we inherit and what do we pass on to? And I think, I'm curious about, I think I actually wanted to switch gears a little bit because we're coming up sort of towards the end, and I want to think more about so it's advocacy in the arts and what like impact you want to have, or authors have this unique platform to communicate and to reach a lot of people and to shape their thinking or to shift their thinking in a lot of ways. Is that something that you think about after a story is drafted, or when does that come into it, if at all?
For me, it's during, because again, I grew up in a religion that you don't do anything. You don't drink, you don't smoke, you don't. So I remember my first book being published and people coming up to my mom at church asking, is Rachel okay? Because I'm writing what I'm writing. And so I'm always kind of thoughtful of what it is that I'm writing, what I'm saying, being careful not to tell secrets. Everybody has family secrets, and kind of talking about them, but not. But for other writers, I am very, you saw me at the California Crime Writers Conference. I want to pass it forward because so many, like Jervey and everybody were very kind to me. And this is hard. To take an idea and to stay with it for, between 70, 90, 100,000 words and have it make sense it's something. It's not going in the coal mines, but, art is a reason, there's a reason why we created. So anyone who ever has questions for me, I try to always make time to share what I know, to be very honest about my own journey, to assure people that you don't have to be a certain age to have succeeded. I grew up with that whole 30 under 30 granta list and that kind of bullshit. And I think the older you get, the more interesting you get, the more stuff happens to you, and you have better context of why people do what they do, because you're 40s, or, I'm sandwich generation. So I got old people there and my daughter over there, and here I am, poor, broke, trying to figure things out. So yeah, any writer that asks questions, I look forward to answering those, because yeah, it's hard. It can be lonely. Sometimes it makes no sense. You don't know what a writer, an editor's looking for or an agent's looking for. Some are trying to rip you off, and there's a lot. There's a lot. Even though there's a lot of information on the web, there's nothing like talking to someone who's actually doing it. Yeah.
It's weird when you realize that they might not be your friends, your agents and editors, that they have totally different agenda than you do.
Oh yeah. No, I had, like, after my first agent, we broke up, and then I had like 3 or so, and they all sucked. And then I found my current one, the current agent, Joe Marshall, who's been my agent since 2013. And she's just she's been a blessing to me. She's brought me, random activities and projects to do because she cared about not just this one book, but my career. Yeah, so I'm one of the lucky ones.
And I want to echo something that you said, Rachel, about the lonely process of writing. And then this is what I appreciate is platforms like this and classrooms and being invited to festivals and communing with other writers and kids. Like often I find that, especially whenever I'm invited to another country, even though my writing is not is not suitable for children, I'm often sent to speak to elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, as well as, college and adults, and that sort of in juvenile hall populations, and all of that to me is the gift. It's like the gift to my heart for the writing, because it's like the books get me out there in community and gives me a sense that yes, we're all here, we're all one, we're all love. That's why I think that I do it, but I feel like I have to do it because it's just who I am. But from the larger, place, it's like that my soul chose that in order to be with everyone like we are together now.
I love that idea. And the arts are one of the places that pulls people together.
Yes.
And it feels like there's not a lot of those these days that anyone, can meet at. And I don't know, I think that's something special.
Yep, definitely.
It is, yeah, absolutely.
So what are you looking forward to in your writing, in your career? What's next? I'd love to hear from each of you so that we can all be there to champion you on that journey.
I'm looking forward to like landing how to write a big fantasy, because I've always looked for interesting ways to tell a story. And this is just one more avenue, one more way I can infiltrate someone's mind to have them think what I think. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to continuing to look around me and being a big mouth about the things that I'm really concerned about or scared about.
And I'm working on a novel now, but what I'm looking forward to is this new world of opera, and the composer is now working on the music to, the words that I've written, and then I just know that I'm just going to be in tears when the singers are singing. It just, I'm just blown away by this.
That's amazing.
So very, very,
Very cool.
That's what I'm looking forward to. Yeah.
Say the way you and I met was when I was working with my writing partner on POC United, which is an artist collective for people of color. We put together our first anthology, and so we had a cohort of people that we put through like a workshop where they were working on submitting their work, and so we are reconnecting with all of them. We created a safe space for writers of color to write about things outside of their trauma, racism, and anti-racism, to write about other things in life. And so I'm excited about that because we're continuing that work this year. And I have some longer works. I followed Tana Nareed Dew's advice and I started short, but I do have some longer works that I'm working on, and are really tackling the society's oppression of women, looking at more feminist horror, which I realize are themes that come up in my work. And so I'm working on that now, and I'm really excited about it.
Keep us posted on the PSC United and that work. I'd love to read it. Jervey, how about you?
Well, I don't really want to chase my agent down. It's like, what's going on with the book? But um, we started this thing called Lit Fest Pasadena, and
Yeah.
it's pretty big. And it was basically my editor kicked me to the curb, and I was like, what to do? Start a literary festival. And a lot of it takes place at the Mausoleum in Altadena,
It's beautiful.
and
Yeah.
they don't charge us anything. So
It was stunning.
yeah, it would be really fun. If anyone's interested in doing anything or putting together a panel or for LitFest, it'll be starts in the summer. That would be great. And really want to stress diversity. And so we do have a very diverse literary festival.
What year number is this? How many years is the festival?
It's been a long time.
Yeah, I'm curious what year this is.
I wish I knew. I would have to ask Tom from the Lightbringer. I think he would have a better idea.
Yeah.
But I do think we probably are one of the more diverse literary festivals in the country.
Yes.
Because we started off with that intention.
I think I've been to every one, but I'm just trying to think how far back how long has it been?
Right. When it was
Yeah.
enormous.
I think it's at least like 6 years, maybe 7 years.
More.
Oh, it's more than that.
More.
I remember going like around
I think you said
2008
it started in 20,
or so, but it
2020.
was in Pasadena.
Oh, you found it?
Said in the chat.
It did start in Pasadena. It did. And I think we did things out of that park. And it didn't make any sense, because people walk by and you got bees and stuff. So
The
in a mausoleum,
reading,
they're just totally chill. They don't care what we do. And they make so much money, I think, with people. They use it for film shoots.
yeah.
So they're always these big trucks and everything. So I think they make so much money, they just, are accommodating.
I went this last year, and the reading inside the mausoleum with the stained glass windows and you're surrounded by the crypts. Like it was a real experience, and it made me want to hear more from authors about this, like, interplay between the living and the dead. And I hope that maybe we can do an event around that at some point. But that was powerful, and it's a really cool event. I hope to be there this year too.
Hey, if you want to do that panel, if you want to pull that together, we totally
Yes, I
support.
just
Sounds
volunteered.
great. That sounds
So that's
really
the other
great.
thing is like essentially we just do whatever we think we should do. There's no structure. I mean, they listen to me probably because I'm the only writer amongst them, but it's fun, and I want to keep growing it. And I think finally somebody will recognize how diverse we are and what we're managing to do, and we'll get more support without having to beg for it or apply for all those grants.
Well, I am so grateful to each of you, Jervey, Rachel, Tamika, Lisa. This was fantastic. I wish you the best going forward, and thank you for sharing your stories with us.
Thank you for having us. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed this. Enjoyed this with all of you.
I'll see you sometime in West Hollywood, and take care and stay dry.
I hope to see you guys at LitFest. If you have any
Yes,
ideas for a panel,
absolutely.
just let us, to do something, just let me know. Let us know.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.